You're listening to A Slice of Therapy with me, Alun Parry. If you ever listen to a biography of a football manager, whether they're kind of very old school ones, say from the 60s and 70s, or even some of the more modern ones that I've listened to recently, you'll notice that one of the things they all kind of have in common is the issue of how to kind of deal with a wayward player. So somebody, for instance, who's got quite a bit of talent, so they really want them to stay in the team, but they're not particularly training very well, and they're not working particularly hard. And despite the fact that they're professional athletes, they're not necessarily looking after their bodies as a professional athlete might. You know, they're going out on the town and all that sort of stuff. And one of the things that always crops up that I notice is what these football managers are really keen to happen in the lives of these wayward players is they're always keen for them to get into a long-term relationship and have kids. And what they really want is for them to settle down. And then when they settle down, their hope is, as the football manager, their hope is that this player will then become more professional and more reliable. And they often do. You'll hear these biographies and then you'll hear this kind of talented but kind of roguish player suddenly really settles down because they enter a relationship and they become a father. So why is it that these players will settle down? Why is it that these football managers are wanting that for some of their players? Well, the reason is because once they settle down and become a father, it changes their whole identity. When they become a father, there's a switch in identity which brings all sorts of changes. And these changes happen fast because when you switch your identity, a lot of things kind of happen almost like a domino effect. Once they embody that new identity, it results in behaviour change that tends to be fast rather than slow. And so what these old football managers understood, even all the way back then, is that when somebody's identity changes, so does everything else. Now, the thing is, it doesn't really need for the situation to change in order to embody a new identity. In that example, they were really hoping for their situation to change, that they would settle down and have some kids and become a father and take on the role and identity of that. But the reality doesn't actually have to change in order for us to take on a new identity. We can choose that identity whenever we want. You know, if we want to take on the identity of loving father, for instance, you can do that even before you've had your first child. Now, the reality change obviously helps. It really invites you into a new identity. But the identity change can be something that we choose. And in our own lives, we can choose an identity for ourselves as well. So we can decide to choose the identity of whatever it is that we want. We can choose to take on the identity of a prolific writer. We can choose to take on the identity of a good friend. We can choose to take on the identity of a successful business person, or a loving partner, or a caring parent, or whatever identity it is that you would really like to be. And you can start being that right away. You don't have to wait for any outcome to happen. You can simply start wearing that identity, taking on that identity and being that person as soon as you like. You can become that person right now. It doesn't need a life. It doesn't need your life to change in order to do it. You simply need to embody that role and that identity. In fact, there's even an argument to say that it's the identity change that will bring about the wider change. So if you wanted to be a prolific writer, for instance, it's going to be taking on the mantle, the identity of a prolific writer that is going to turn you into one. Because after all, a prolific writer writes. And so that leads us into how you actually take on the identity. In the first instance, you choose it, but then what do you do after that? Well, the best way is to ask yourself, well, suppose I was already that thing. Suppose that I was a prolific writer, or suppose I was a good friend. Suppose I really was a successful business person. Suppose I am a loving partner. Suppose I am a caring parent. Or whatever it is that you want it to be. Suppose you were already that thing. Like, what would you notice about yourself if that were true? What would you see yourself doing if you're already a successful business person, if you're already a prolific writer, if you're already a caring parent, whatever it happens to be, if you are already that thing, what would you see yourself doing? And how would you be interacting with others as that person? What would you notice about yourself as that person? And then you can actually sit there and make a list. That if you actually already had this identity and was acting according to this identity, what would you be doing? What would you notice about yourself? How would you be interacting with others differently? And then you can make that list, you can write it down. And now you have a template of what it would look like if you'd not just chosen the identity, but decided to actually live it. Because once you've got the list, all you have to do then is follow that list, is to act in integrity with that list, and to do it because you are that person that you've chosen to be, because you have that identity that you've chosen to have. After all, if that's who you want to be, then you don't have to wait for it. You don't have to wait for some external event to happen. You can take on that identity right now, because once you've asked that question of what that would look like, if you really were that person, if you really did live true to that identity, once you've got that list, you know what that looks like, and so you can simply be it. Whether the external world changes or not, you can simply choose to be that person. The writer James Clear said a quote that I really like, and I've probably said it before on one of these episodes, but what he wrote was that every action that we take is a vote for the person that we want to become. So every action is a vote for the person that we want to become. And so when we actually connect to an identity and say, well, because I am this thing, I do these things, I do these actions. When we do those actions, we actually vote for the person that we want to become. We actually grow into that identity every single time we take that action. So if you want to be a prolific writer, or a creative artist, or a caring parent, or a successful business person, or a good friend, or a caring parent, or a loving pet owner, whatever it happens to be, then you can actually enact that identity and take it on as your own and do those things. And then the identity and the changes that it brings become yours to embody right now. Not that you have to wait for anything else to happen in the world, but it becomes yours to embody right away. So let's recap on that. We saw, didn't we, how those old football managers always wanted their wayward players to settle down and have some children. And that the reason why is because they wanted their identity to change. And they wanted their identity to change to father, with all of the kind of responsibilities and changes and a different sense of themselves that brings. But we also saw that we don't really need anything to change at all in the outside world for us to assume a new identity. And in our lives, then, we can just choose an identity. And we can ask ourselves, suppose I am that thing already. What would that look like? How would I be behaving if I really was that identity that I'm choosing to take on board? What would living true to that identity actually look like? How would I be? And how would I be with others? And how would I be towards myself? And what are the things that I would notice myself doing? What are the actions I would see myself taking? And in that list that we build, we have our template. And all that we have to do then is follow that list. And we saw how James Clear said that every action that we take is a vote for the person that we want to become. So the more that we follow that list, the more we actually take on board the identity we want. And then we do the things that kind of person does because that's who we happen to be. That the identity leads and the actions actually follow. And so if we want to live that identity and take it on as our own, then all we have to do is choose it and live it. And that's something that we can decide for ourselves right away. So thanks for listening. If you found it useful, please share it so somebody else can find it useful as well. If you'd like to work with me directly one-to-one, I'm Alun Parry, and you can find out more at liverpoolpsychotherapy.co.uk. And of course, it doesn't matter where you're based because I work online, so you don't have to be local to me. And please do subscribe to the podcast. It's completely free, and it means that you never miss an episode again. So thanks very much for listening, and I'll be back again tomorrow with another one.